The lake was still that morning, a flat pane of water surrounded by thick walls of spruce and pine. Fog hung in strips across the shoreline, clinging low like smoke from a fire long since gone out. The Hog's Back recreation site wasn't much, a scattering of campsites carved out of the bush, a gravel loop, the smell of damp earth rising from the ground. It was the sort of place that looked the same year after year, a pocket of wilderness that kept its own time. On May 28, 2011, it became a stage no one in British Columbia would ever forget. A single tent sat collapsed on the ground, its fabric wet with dew and sagging as though it had given up. Next to it, a faded green Ford F-150 pickup. The truck was locked tight. Inside, her purse lay untouched, stuffed with the usual clutter. Wallet, ID, a few small things. Not stolen, not rifled through, just waiting. Even bottles of liquor, unopened, sat close by. Whoever left this place hadn't come back for them. But something was missing. Two things, actually. The phone, an iPhone 4 in a light blue case. Gone. The keys, a heavy ring, looped on a Gothic-style lanyard. Gone too. The timeline is brutal in its precision. Somewhere between 4 o'clock and 8:30 that morning, 20-year-old Madison Scott vanished. A narrow window, but in the silence of the campsite, it felt like infinity. No footprints pointing down a trail, no dropped jacket in the underbrush, just the hollow quiet of the forest and the eerie sight of a tent that should have been zipped up from the inside, now gaping open like an unanswered question. Welcome back to the Vanished Dockets. If you're new here, we cover true stories of disappearances and unsolved mysteries with the depth and respect they deserve. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. It helps us keep these cases alive and in the public eye. Before the search grids and police tape, she was more than the mystery. In Vanderhoof, British Columbia, the town sits pressed between rivers and forest, a place where you can smell wood smoke in the winter and hear dirt bikes cutting across trails in the summer. That's where Madison Scott grew up, born April 29, 1991, the second child of Eldon and Dawn. She was 20 years old when she disappeared, but those who knew her would tell you Maddie's story wasn't defined by that single night. It was defined by everything that came before. Imagine her on the rink, skates carving into the ice, hair damp with sweat under a helmet, cheeks flushed. She loved hockey, loved the grit of it, the rush of being part of a team. In spring, she swapped the rink for the ball field, swinging a bat under the long northern sun. And when she wasn't playing sports, she was often behind a camera, chasing the perfect photo. A goofy shot of friends at a bonfire, a landscape dripping with color. She had another side, too, the mechanic's apprentice. Grease-stained hands, a wrench in her grip, working alongside her father. She wasn't afraid to get dirty, wasn't afraid of engines or the stubborn bolts that wouldn't move without a fight. It was the kind of work that fit her, practical, hands-on, strong. Friends describe her as the kind of person who filled space with laughter. She could pull someone into a joke with just a grin. She wasn't the girl in the corner, she was the spark in the middle of it all. Outgoing, vibrant, fiercely loyal. If you were in Maddie's circle, you knew she had your back. But loyalty cuts both ways. It means you stay when others leave. It means you believe there's no harm in spending one more night at a party by the lake. That's the portrait that makes her absence so haunting. She wasn't a drifter. She wasn't someone looking to vanish. She was a daughter, a friend, an apprentice, an athlete, a young woman just beginning to shape her own life. And then, gone. The RCMP would later say they did not believe she simply walked away. And when you hear who she was, it's impossible to imagine otherwise. Friday, May 27, 2011. The forest road leading to Hogsback Lake was alive that evening. Headlights flickered between the trees as vehicles rumbled down the gravel, music already spilling from lowered windows. It was a birthday party, the kind people in small towns wait for, a chance to drink under the stars, laugh too loud, and pretend for one night the wilderness was their private kingdom. Madison Scott drove out with her friend Jourdain. They set up camp, Maddie's tent pitched on the damp ground, her Ford F-150 parked nearby. The lake shimmered in the twilight, mosquitoes hanging thick in the air, the kind of detail you don't notice when you're 20 and full of adrenaline. The crowd grew as the sky darkened. Bonfire flames stretched upward, sparks drifting like fireflies into the night. Music pounded from car stereos, beer cans cracked open, voices rose and fell in waves. Maddie was right in the middle of it, laughing, leaning in to catch conversations, her phone tucked somewhere nearby. To anyone watching, she looked at ease, just another young woman enjoying a night out. But parties in the woods can turn. The laughter can sharpen. Voices can edge toward confrontation. Around midnight, a fight broke out, loud, chaotic, the kind of moment that splits a gathering. Some people scattered into the dark, others pressed in close to watch. Jourdain made a decision then. She was leaving. She urged Maddie to come too, but Maddie chose to stay. Her tent was already set, her truck locked and safe, her night not yet finished. That choice would mark the timeline forever. The hours after Jourdain left are blurred, filled only with fragments. Witnesses later said Maddie was last seen around 3 a.m. The fire was burning lower, music thinning, people stumbling off to cars or tents. Somewhere in that fog of early morning, Maddie slipped out of the story. By 8:30 a.m., Jourdain returned. The party was long over, silence replacing the chaos of the night. She saw Maddie's tent, unzipped, oddly askew. No Maddie. No sound of her laughter. No scuff of her boots on gravel. The truck was still there, locked, but Maddie wasn't. And then came Saturday night. Word had spread fast that the campsite was empty, but instead of turning the place into a memorial of concern, another group of partiers showed up. Music blasted again, engines roared, alcohol flowed. By the time Sunday came, Maddie's tent was no longer standing. It had been trampled, collapsed into a heap of mud. That detail is one of the most haunting in the case. A tent, once a small symbol of safety, reduced to a heap under the feet of strangers. If there were clues there, faint tracks, subtle marks, they may have been erased by the revelry of that second night. The evidence of her presence blurred by people who never thought to stop and ask why her belongings were still there without her. Her parents would arrive the next day, May 29th, to find the scene. A purse locked inside the truck, bottles of liquor unopened, tent collapsed, phone and keys missing. Their daughter gone. The RCMP later called the window between 4 and 8:30 a.m. critical, but for her family, every second of that weekend was critical. Every detail gnawed at them. Why did Jourdain leave? Why did Maddie stay? Who saw her after midnight? Who touched her phone? Who had her keys? And what happened in the shadows between the dying bonfire and the rising sun? That night at Hogsback Lake has been retold in Vanderhoof 1,000 different ways. Some people whisper it was someone she knew. Others insist it was a stranger passing through. But when you strip away the speculation, the story always narrows to the same image. A young woman in her tent at a lakeside party, seen at 3 in the morning, and never again. The forest remembers, the lake remembers, but it has not yet spoken.
The call went out before noon on May 29, 2011. Within hours, Vanderhoof felt like a town under siege, not by enemies, but by the unknown. At first, it was family and friends who combed the shoreline of Hogsback Lake, voices echoing as they shouted Maddie's name. Then came the professionals, RCMP officers in green and navy uniforms, vehicles pulling in from every direction, headlights cutting through the mist. Soon the quiet forest had become a command post. Searchers fanned out on foot, boots sinking into mud, branches slapping against their faces as they pushed deeper into the trees. Horses were brought in, their hooves steady on the rough terrain, riders scanning from a higher vantage. All-terrain vehicles roared along gravel roads, weaving through cut lines, spitting dust as they went. From above, the thunder of rotors broke the sky. A helicopter hovered low, its infrared camera sweeping the ground in precise arcs, searching for any hint of heat, any sign of life hidden beneath the canopy. Divers slipped beneath the surface of the lake, bubbles rising as they vanished into the black water. Search dogs barked, straining against leashes, noses twitching as they caught scents carried on the damp wind. It was a sight most communities never witness, hundreds of people converging, united in a single purpose. They searched through rain and fog, through fatigue and silence. Each hour that passed made the silence louder. Days rolled into one another. The tents of volunteers lined the edges of the wreck site. Maps were unrolled on hoods of trucks, marked with circles and grids. Clear this section, move to the next. The method was clinical. The emotions were not. Mothers and fathers joined hands, children clutched posters, and neighbors showed up with food and coffee for those who refused to stop. But with every grid cleared, the weight of absence grew heavier. No jacket, no phone, no tracks leading away, not even a trace disturbed in the undergrowth. It was as if the forest had closed in behind her. By June 1st, just 4 days after Maddie vanished, the official ground search was scaled back. The RCMP made it clear. The case wasn't closed, but the boots-on-the-ground effort, the sweeping lines of volunteers, the endless circles on the maps, that part ended. For the Scott family, it was a moment of shattering. To stop searching the forest felt like admitting she wasn't there to be found. Yet the RCMP pivot was telling. They weren't giving up, they were shifting. Investigators no longer spoke as if Maddie had wandered off. They began to say words like foul play and suspicious circumstances. The trucks rolled out, the horses trailered back home, and the last of the volunteers dispersed. The forest closed over again, silent, watchful, unchanged. What lingered was the echo of a search that threw everything at the mystery and found nothing. And in that nothing, the questions only deepened.
The first week after Maddie vanished felt like a storm. Sirens, helicopters, and endless boots crunching across gravel roads. But storms pass. What comes after is harder, the silence that stretches for years. Vanderhoof refused to let the silence win. Every May, engines revved again, not in search of Maddie, but in her honor. They called it On the Trail to Find Maddie, a poker ride across back roads and forest trails. Horses lined up, their riders holding worn playing cards. ATVs rumbled and dirt bikes buzzed. Hundreds of people rode out, rain or shine, just to remind the world that a young woman had vanished and her family was still waiting. Dust rose behind the convoys, voices shouted across the trails, and banners with Maddie's face flapped in the wind. It wasn't just a ride, it was defiance, a way of saying we will not let her fade. On Highway 16, the infamous Highway of Tears, drivers couldn't miss her. Her photograph stared down from billboards with dark eyes, an easy smile, and hair falling across her shoulders. Posters filled shop windows and gas stations, each one asking the same simple, unbearable question: where is Madison Scott? For travelers passing through,
It was a haunting stop sign. For locals, it was a constant reminder that the search had no end. The Scotts poured everything into keeping her memory alive. They didn't just hope, they fought. A reward of up to $100,000 was announced, offered to anyone who could break the silence. Eldon and Dawn spoke to reporters with steady voices, even when the cracks showed underneath. "We just need answers," they said, again and again. It was the plea of parents who'd learned how to live with the unlivable. The RCMP kept the case active. Detectives repeated what they knew. Maddie was last seen around 3 a.m., May 28, 2011. Her tent was left behind, her truck was locked, her purse was untouched, her phone and keys gone. And then came the words that burned into the community's memory. "We do not believe Madison simply walked away." Year after year, the RCMP returned to the public. At anniversaries, they stood in front of cameras and made new appeals. Sometimes they spoke of suspicious circumstances. Sometimes they narrowed the focus. In 2020, they drew the sharpest line yet. Something happened between 4 and 8:30 a.m. They didn't say what, they didn't say who, but in that 4-hour window, they believed the truth was buried. For Vanderhoof, those statements weren't just updates, they were fuel. Each time, people pinned on buttons, dusted off posters, and shared her story again. Because if Maddie could disappear in their own backyard, then silence was dangerous. At vigils, candles flickered in the northern dusk, faces lit by orange flame. Friends told stories about her laughter, her stubborn streak, and the way she filled a room. Teammates wore jerseys in her honor, hockey sticks leaned against fences, and softball gloves were held in the air. Every object became a symbol of who she was and what had been taken. But persistence takes a toll. You could see it in the lines on her parents' faces, in the tremble of their voices. You could hear it in the pauses when friends spoke her name. 13 birthdays passed without her. 13 Christmas mornings. 13 years of holding out hope while knowing each day made answers feel further away. Still, the community refused to let the question die. "Where is Madison Scott?" became a chorus that echoed off highway billboards, rode across poker trails, and whispered in the quiet of family kitchens. And though no new answers came, the persistence itself mattered. It mattered because it meant Maddie wasn't just a file number gathering dust in some drawer. She was present. Her name was alive. And her case, unsolved, unanswered, unbearable, was never forgotten. This is the endurance phase of the story, where the fight to remember her became just as important as the search itself.
For 12 years, Hogsback Lake had been frozen in memory. Every tree, every stone, every ripple of water tied to the last known sighting of Madison Scott. Vanderhoof lived with the ache of that silence. And then, in May 2023, something shifted. It didn't begin with fanfare. No crowds, no breaking news crawls at the start. Just quiet RCMP vehicles pulling down a rural road east of Vanderhoof, engines crunching gravel under spring rain. A search warrant had been executed on a property, the kind of detail that sounds clinical on paper, but felt, in the hearts of Maddie's family, like the air tightening in their lungs. The property was ordinary at first glance, a spread of farmland with brush pushing at the fences, old buildings leaning with age, a place you might drive past 1,000 times without a second thought. But in May of 2023, it became the site where silence finally broke. Officers moved methodically, boots sinking into soft ground. The scene was cordoned with yellow tape flapping in the wind, a thin plastic ribbon separating routine life from a crime scene. Neighbors watched from a distance, whispering, their voices low, as if speaking too loudly would disturb whatever secret was buried there. And then came the confirmation. The RCMP announced that remains had been located on that rural property. Forensic testing confirmed what so many had feared, and yet what so many had begged to know. They were Madison Scott's. The words landed like a hammer. After 12 years of not knowing, after 12 birthdays and Christmases without answers, the Scott family finally had one. Not the answer they prayed for, but an answer nonetheless. Their daughter, their sister, their friend, no longer missing. For the investigators, the discovery was both breakthrough and heartbreak. The RCMP emphasized the case was not closed. They had long suspected foul play, and now they said it plainly. Maddie had not simply walked away. A crime had occurred, and somewhere in the folds of Vanderhoof, someone knew the truth. The community's response was instant and overwhelming. By early June, more than 2,000 people gathered for a vigil in Vanderhoof. They came in jerseys, honoring her love of hockey and softball. They came with candles, their flames dancing in the dusk, fragile but fierce. They came with memories, stories spilling into the night air, of Maddie's laughter, her stubbornness, her spark. The scene was surreal. A field of light in the darkness, every flicker a promise that she would not be forgotten. Parents held their children close. Friends clutched photographs. Strangers who had only ever seen her face on a billboard stood shoulder to shoulder with those who had grown up with her. Grief became collective, stretching across Vanderhoof like a blanket. There was a strange symmetry in it all. In 2011, people had gathered at Hogsback Lake, dancing by a bonfire, music echoing off the trees. In 2023, they gathered again, this time in silence. The only sound the crackle of candles and the murmurs of prayer. The bookends of a community story. Joy and laughter on one end, heartbreak and mourning on the other. The rural property east of Vanderhoof became a point of fixation. Media crews stood outside the taped-off area, cameras pointed toward remarkable barns and fields. Reporters used words like warrant, active investigation, suspected foul play. But to locals, it was more than that. It was the place where Maddie had been hidden all those years. The ordinary turned ominous. People drove by slowly, windows rolled down, as if they could see something in the air. Some avoided the road altogether, unable to bear the thought. For the Scott family, the property represented both devastation and relief. The nightmare of confirmation, the small mercy of no longer wondering if she was still out there, waiting to be found. The questions multiplied. Why here? Who brought her to this place? How had it stayed a secret for so long? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did it take 12 years for the truth to surface? The RCMP's message was steady but restrained. They would not release details of cause of death. They did not identify suspects. They only asked again for tips, for anyone who knew anything to come forward. They repeated that the case was active, that justice was still the goal. For some, that gave hope. For others, it felt like another wound, another reminder that answers, even after discovery, were still incomplete. At the vigil, Eldon and Dawn stood surrounded by light. They thanked the community, thanked the searchers, thanked everyone who had kept Maddie's name alive. Their voices carried both gratitude and grief, like two halves of the same truth. Behind them, a banner with Maddie's photograph rippled in the evening wind. Children clutched stuffed animals. Teenagers held signs. Adults bowed their heads. Some wept openly. Others stood stiff, jaws clenched, refusing to let tears fall. Grief takes many shapes, but in that moment, it was shared. The vigil stretched late into the night, until candles melted to stubs and the air grew cold. People lingered anyway, reluctant to leave, as if walking away felt like abandoning her again. 12 years. That's how long it took for her to come home. And yet, even in her return, the mystery only deepened. Because if Madison Scott's remains were found east of Vanderhoof in 2023, then what happened in those crucial hours between 4 and 8:30 a.m. back in 2011? Who carried her into the silence? And how many people kept that silence alive? The discovery was not closure. It was a door, opening into darker, heavier questions that still demanded answers. Mojo, in that field of candles and jerseys, Vanderhoof came together once more, not just to mourn, but to say her name, Madison Scott. Gone,
but not erased. Found, but not yet given justice.
It has been 14 years since Madison Scott vanished from Hogsback Lake. 14 years since her tent sagged into the dirt, her truck stood locked and waiting, her phone and keys slipped away into the dark. In May 2023, her remains were found on a rural property east of Vanderhoof. For some families, that kind of discovery becomes closure. For the Scotts, it became something else entirely. Confirmation of loss, but not of justice. Because the case remains unsolved. The RCMP's Major Crime Unit continues to lead the file. In their words, the investigation is active and ongoing. They've repeated it in every anniversary appeal, every press release. This is not over. They believe someone, somewhere, knows what happened to Maddie. In May 2024, 13 years to the day after she disappeared, RCMP renewed their call for information. They restated the reward of up to $100,000 for tips leading to an arrest and conviction. They pointed again to that critical window between 4 and 8:30 a.m. on May 28, 2011, as the key to unlocking the mystery. They reminded the public that Maddie did not simply walk away. And in May 2025, as the 14th anniversary arrived, the message had not changed. CFNR and regional outlets echoed the words, "No new developments have been announced, but the investigation continues. Vanderhoof still waits." For the community, it's a strange kind of limbo. Maddie is no longer missing. Her family no longer wonders if she is alive somewhere, waiting to be found. Yet they still live with unanswered questions, with the shadow of someone out there who knows the truth. The posters remain, the billboards remain, the poker rides still roar through the back roads, because in Vanderhoof, memory has become resistance. Forgetting is not an option. And so the story lingers. A tent, a truck, a missing phone, a 4-hour window carved into history, a family who refuses to let her name fade. Madison Scott. Not just a case, not just a headline. A daughter, a sister, a friend, stolen from a lakeside campsite, hidden away for 12 long years, and now returned without answers. The investigation is still open. The tip lines are still active. The reward is still waiting. Justice is not yet here.